Blood dripped onto the harsh concrete floor, but Vincenzo Coppola did not blink. His phone vibrated with coordinates that would ignite a bloody Mafia war across the city. Then his security chief leaned in. "Sir, she has been sleeping here." The burner phone clattered to the floor. The war would just have to wait. The basement of the Coppola Syndicate headquarters in Brooklyn smelled of iron, damp earth, and expensive cologne. Vincenzo Coppola, the undisputed head of the most ruthless family on the eastern seaboard, wiped a stray drop of blood from his knuckles. He was 29 years old, a man carved from marble and violence, whose reputation for merciless efficiency kept the 5 boroughs in a stranglehold. Tied to the chair in front of him was a high-ranking captain of the Lombardi crime family. Vincenzo was minutes away from extracting the location of Hugo Lombardi, his mortal enemy and the architect of a recent massacre at the Coppola-controlled docks. Vincenzo reached for a steel wrench resting on a metal tray. He was prepared to break every bone in the man's hands, one by one, until he got the answer he needed. His phone buzzed in his pocket, signaling an incoming message from his network of informants in Miami, ready to greenlight an assassination. He pulled it out, his thumb hovering over the screen. That was when Matteo, his oldest friend and chief of security, stepped into the dimly lit interrogation room. Matteo looked rattled, a rare sight for a man who had survived 2 cartel wars. He bypassed the bleeding man in the chair and stepped directly into Vincenzo's personal space, lowering his voice to a frantic whisper. "Sir, we found the breach. She has been sleeping here, right under our noses." Vincenzo froze. He let the phone slip from his fingers. It hit the concrete with a sharp crack, the screen splintering. He dropped the heavy wrench onto the tray. "Where?" Vincenzo demanded, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal edge that made the bound Lombardi captain flinch. "In the old decommissioned server room on sub-level 4, Matteo replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "We caught a phantom power draw on the thermal cameras. I went down there with a strike team, expecting to find a Lombardi rat planting explosives. Instead, we found her. Paola Fontana." The name hung in the damp air, heavy and electric. Paola Fontana was not a soldier, nor a maid woman, nor a rival boss. She was a ghost. For the past 6 months, the entire criminal underworld had been hunting the nameless phantom who had systematically breached the impenetrable offshore banking network of Hugo Lombardi. The hacker had siphoned millions and downloaded decades of blackmail, extortion ledgers, and bribery records. Hugo Lombardi had put a $5 million bounty on the hacker's head. Vincenzo had been looking for the phantom too, hoping to acquire the Lombardi ledgers to utterly destroy his rival. Only a week ago, Vincenzo's intelligence network had finally attached a name to the ghost. Paola Fontana, a rogue forensic data analyst from Chicago. But no one had been able to find her, and now she was in his house. "Watch him," Vincenzo ordered, gesturing vaguely to the bleeding man in the chair. "Let him rot until I get back." Vincenzo strode out of the interrogation room, his long legs eating up the distance as he navigated the labyrinth of subterranean concrete corridors. His mind raced. How did a civilian bypass 3 layers of biometric security, armed guards, and motion sensors to infiltrate the Coppola stronghold? The audacity of it was staggering. The sheer brilliance required to hide inside the epicenter of the Coppola empire was undeniable. The safest place to hide from a rabid dog like Hugo Lombardi was inside the den of a much larger, much deadlier predator. He reached sub-level 4, A squad of heavily armed guards stood in a defensive perimeter around a heavy steel door. They parted immediately as Vincenzo approached. He placed his hand on the biometric scanner, and the door hissed open. He stepped into the frigid, dusty server room, expecting to find a hardened operative. Instead, the sight before him made the breath catch in his throat. Lying in the corner, nestled on a makeshift bed of discarded packing blankets and server rack covers, was a woman. She was fast asleep, utterly exhausted. Vincenzo walked closer, his heavy footsteps muffled. Paola Fontana was not the frail, sickly hacker he had envisioned. She was breathtaking. Even covered in dust, wearing an oversized thrift store trench coat, her beauty commanded the room. She was plus-sized, her lush, thick curves spilling softly against the harsh industrial flooring. The heavy coat had fallen open slightly, revealing the soft swell of her full hips and the generous curve of her thighs in worn denim. Her dark hair was a messy halo around a face that was round, flush with the chill of the room, and strikingly angelic. She possessed a grounded, earthy substance that Vincenzo found instantly, violently intoxicating. In a world populated by razor-thin socialites and calculating, hardened women, Paola looked like warmth incarnate. But as Vincenzo looked closer, he saw the brutal reality of her survival. There were dark, purple shadows under her eyes. A fading yellowish bruise marred her jawline. Her knuckles were scraped raw. She had been running for her life. She had survived through pure, stubborn resilience. Vincenzo felt a sudden, terrifying shift in his chest. The cold, calculating Mafia boss who viewed people only as assets and liabilities vanished. In his place rose a dark, possessive beast. He did not care about the Lombardi ledgers anymore. He did not care about the millions she had stolen. Looking at the soft rise and fall of her chest, Vincenzo knew with absolute certainty that no one in this world would ever lay a hand on her again. "Clear the room," Vincenzo commanded softly. Matteo hesitated. "Boss, she is a massive liability. If Lombardi finds out she is here." "I said clear the room, Matteo. If anyone breathes a word of her presence to the outside world, I will flay them alive." The guards filed out instantly. Vincenzo knelt on the dusty floor. He reached out, his blood-stained hand hesitating, before he gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. She stirred, a small, soft sound escaping her lips. Vincenzo slid his arms under her heavy, warm body. He lifted her effortlessly, marveling at how perfectly her curves fit against his chest, her weight grounding him in a way he had never experienced. He carried her out of the basement, past the stunned guards, and took the private elevator directly to his impenetrable penthouse suite. He laid her in the center of his massive, king-sized bed, pulling the dark silk sheets over her soft form. He pulled a chair to the corner of the room, sat down in the shadows, and waited for his ghost to wake up. Paola Fontana woke to the smell of fresh coffee, roasted garlic, and danger. She opened her eyes slowly, the plush silk pillowcases confusing her senses. For 6 months, she had slept in bus stations, abandoned cars, and, most recently, the freezing server room of the Coppola Syndicate. She shot up in bed, panic seizing her chest. She patted the secret lining of her oversized coat, which had been draped over a chair nearby. Her breath caught until she felt the hard plastic edges of the encrypted thumb drives sewn into her bra, which she was still wearing beneath her crumpled t-shirt. "You sleep like the dead," a deep, gravelly voice echoed from the corner of the room. Paola froze. She turned her head slowly. Sitting in a leather armchair in the shadows was Vincenzo Coppola. She recognized him instantly from her deep web research. The tailored charcoal trousers, the crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms covered in dark, intricate tattoos, the sharp, aristocratic jawline, and the cold, dead eyes of a killer. She scrambled backward against the headboard, pulling her knees to her chest. She knew she was not conventionally small or fragile. She took up space, her thick thighs and full stomach a stark contrast to the sleek, minimalist luxury of the penthouse. But right now, under Vincenzo's piercing, predatory gaze, she felt entirely exposed. "How did you find me?" Paola managed to say, her voice remarkably steady, despite the terror threatening to drown her. "You plugged a stolen space heater into a dead power grid on my sublevel," Vincenzo replied, leaning forward into the light. "The motion sensors missed you, but the thermal anomaly did not. I have to admit, Miss Fontana, choosing the headquarters of the Coppola Syndicate as a safe house is either the most brilliant or the most suicidal move I have ever witnessed. I needed a place. Hugo Lombardi would never dare to search," Paola said, lifting her chin, refusing to shrink under his heavy stare. "Your compound is a fortress. It was a calculated risk." Vincenzo stood up. He walked toward the bed, his movements predatory and silent. He stopped right at the edge, towering over her. "You are a long way from Chicago. Hugo Lombardi is tearing this city apart, looking for you. He put a bounty on you that has every thug from here to Miami kicking down doors." "Let them kick," Paola said, her voice dropping, filled with a deep, hidden anger. "Hugo Lombardi destroyed my life. He ordered the hit on my father when my dad, a simple accountant, found a missing $100,000 in a front company. Hugo burned my family home to the ground. So I burned his digital empire. I took everything. I have his ledgers, his offshore routing numbers, the names of every corrupt judge on his payroll." She looked Vincenzo dead in the eye. "I know you are at war with him. I will give you the drives. All of it. The keys to Lombardi's destruction. In exchange, you let me walk out of here safely, and you provide a new identity." Vincenzo stared at her. He studied the fierce determination in her brown eyes, the soft, beautiful fullness of her face, the way she bravely tried to negotiate with a man who could snap her neck with one hand. She was magnificent. "I do not want the drives," Vincenzo said softly. Paola blinked, thrown off balance. "What? That is impossible. With that data, you can wipe the Lombardi cartel off the map." "I will wipe Hugo Lombardi off the map with bullets and fire, as is my family's way," Vincenzo replied, sitting on the edge of the mattress. The bed dipped under his weight. Paola shifted, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was. He smelled of gunmetal, expensive soap, and raw power. "Then what do you want?" she asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Vincenzo reached out. Paola flinched, but he only gently traced the fading bruise on her jawline with his thumb. His touch was shockingly tender, a massive contrast to the violence she knew he was capable of. "You are not walking out of here, Paola," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that sent shivers down her spine. "The streets are a meat grinder. If you step outside this compound, Lombardi's men will find you, and they will not be merciful. You are going to stay here, with me, under my protection." "I am not your prisoner," she snapped, her survival instincts flaring. She pushed his hand away. I did not survive 6 months on the run just to become a mafia boss's pet. Not a prisoner, Vincenzo corrected, his eyes dropping to her lips, then trailing down to the soft, generous curves of her body, hidden beneath the blanket. A queen. You walked into the lion's den, Paola. You do not get to leave just because you are tired of the scenery. I am claiming you. Before Paola could process the heavy, terrifying weight of his words, a loud knock echoed through the suite. Matteo entered, pushing a silver room service cart loaded with food. The smell of roasted meats, fresh pasta, and baked bread filled the room. Paola's stomach betrayed her with a loud rumble. "Eat," Vincenzo commanded, stepping back and gesturing to the cart. "I am not hungry," she lied, crossing her arms over her chest, trying to hide her stomach. Vincenzo's eyes darkened. "Do not lie to me. You are exhausted, and you are starving. Eat the food, Paola, or I will sit on this bed and feed it to you myself." The threat was softly spoken, but absolute. Paola glared at him, but the aroma of the garlic and broke her iron will. She slid off the bed, hyper-aware of her thick thighs and the way her clothes clung to her unwashed body. She walked to the table and began to eat. She tried to maintain her dignity, but hunger took over, and she consumed the pasta with desperate urgency. Vincenzo stood by the window, watching her with rapt, unblinking fascination. In his world, women picked at salads and starved themselves into sharp angles. Paola was real. She had an appetite. She had softness. She had substance. Every bite she took only deepened the dark, possessive obsession taking root in his chest. Suddenly, the tranquil silence of the penthouse was shattered by a deafening, blaring siren. The emergency strobe lights in the ceiling began to flash red. Matteo burst back into the room, an assault rifle already strapped to his chest. "Boss, we have a massive problem. Lombardi's men. Dozens of them. They are hitting the main gate with armored SUVs. Vincenzo's face hardened into a mask of pure, terrifying violence. "How did they find us?" Paola dropped her fork, her face going pale. "The drives," she whispered in horror. "There must have been a dormant tracking beacon coded into the root files when I transferred them to the physical drives. When I woke up, the drives warmed against my skin, shifting the biometric lock. It pinged the network. I led them right here." Matteo swore violently. Vincenzo merely unbuttoned his cuffs and walked to a hidden panel in the wall, pulling out 2 heavy Glock handguns. He racked the slides with mechanical precision. "Get into the panic room behind the bookshelf," Vincenzo ordered Paola, not looking at her. "Matteo, lock her in. Do not let her out until every Lombardi rat is dead." "No," Paola said, standing up, her fear entirely replaced by a sudden, fierce adrenaline. Vincenzo turned, his eyes flashing with lethal warning. "This is not a negotiation, Paola. If they hit the main gate, they are going to trigger the secondary blast doors," Paola said rapidly, her brilliant mind already mapping the compound's architecture she had studied before breaking in. "Your men will be trapped in a choke point in the courtyard. But if you get me to a terminal, I can override the gate's hydraulic locks. I can seal Lombardi's men inside the kill zone, between the outer wall and the inner courtyard. You will trap them like rats." Matteo looked at Vincenzo, stunned. "She is right, boss. If she can do that, we wipe out Lombardi's entire strike team in one sweep." Vincenzo stared at Paola. She was terrified, breathing heavily, her soft curves tense with adrenaline. But her eyes were burning with a brilliant, defiant fire. She was not hiding. She was going to war with him. A dark, thrilled smile curved Vincenzo's lips. The beast inside him roared in approval. "Come with me, ghost," Vincenzo said, tossing her a Kevlar vest. "Let's introduce Hugo Lombardi to the woman who is going to end his empire." The descent into the security command center was a blur of concrete corridors, flashing red emergency strobes, and the deafening echo of automatic gunfire. Paola felt the heavy weight of the Kevlar vest pressing against her chest, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She was not a soldier, and she was not built for sprints. Her thick thighs burned with lactic acid, her soft stomach aching with the exertion. But pure, unadulterated survival instinct pushed her forward. Ahead of her, Vincenzo moved like a phantom of death. He did not run. He stalked, his heavy hand clearing the blind corners with terrifying, mechanical precision. Every time Paola stumbled, Vincenzo's large, steady hand was there, grabbing her arm, grounding her, pulling her through the chaos with a raw, protective strength that made her heart pound faster than the gunfire. They reached the reinforced steel doors of the primary surveillance hub. Matteo was already there, laying down, suppressing fire down a parallel hallway. The pungent smell of cordite and shattered drywall choked the air. "Get her on the terminal!" Matteo roared over the sound of his assault rifle, slamming a fresh magazine into his weapon. They brought breaching charges. The outer gate is going to fall in exactly 2 minutes. Vincenzo shoved the heavy steel door open and pulled Paola inside, slamming it shut and locking the heavy deadbolts. The command center was a cavern of glowing monitors, showing the violent assault taking place on the surface. Dozens of heavily armed men in tactical gear were swarming the Coppola compound courtyard, taking cover behind armored SUVs and firing relentlessly at Vincenzo's guards stationed on the upper parapets. Paola did not hesitate. She dropped into the leather chair in front of the main terminal, her fingers flying over the mechanical keyboard. The interface was a proprietary Unix system, highly encrypted, but Paola had spent the last 2 months memorizing its architecture from the outside. Now that she was inside the network, the firewalls melted beneath her keystrokes. "Talk to me, ghost," Vincenzo said, standing directly behind her chair. He rested one heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. The touch sent a shock wave down her spine, a strange anchor in the middle of a war zone. "They are bypassing the hydraulic locks on the main gate, using a brute force sequence," Paola said, her eyes scanning lines of rapidly scrolling code. "I cannot stop the gate from opening, but I can change the parameter of the secondary blast doors." "Do it," Vincenzo commanded, his eyes fixed on the security feeds. Paola typed furiously, her mind slipping into the cold, calculated flow state that had kept her alive for 6 months. Hugo Lombardi had ruined her life. He had taken her father, her home, her peace. Now, sitting in the lap of the Coppola empire, surrounded by the enemy of her enemy, Paola found her revenge. "The outer gates are breached," she announced, her voice eerily calm. On the monitors, the massive iron gates of the compound groaned and gave way. Lombardi's strike team surged forward, flooding into the narrow, high-walled choke point between the outer perimeter and the inner courtyard doors. "Wait for it," Vincenzo murmured, his grip on her shoulder tightening. His presence was overwhelming, a dark, heavy shadow wrapped around her. Let them all get inside. Paola watched the heat signatures on the thermal imaging screen. 40 men. 45. They were pouring into the gap, confident they had broken the Coppola defenses. "Now!" Paola whispered, and slammed the enter key. Hydraulic engines screamed in protest. On the screens, the massive steel blast doors of the inner courtyard slammed shut, locking the path forward. A second later, the outer iron gates, which the Lombardi men thought they had destroyed, suddenly jerked to life, propelled by emergency backup generators Paola had just overridden. The outer gates slammed shut behind the strike team. The Lombardi men were trapped. They were boxed into a concrete corridor with no cover, no exit, and no hope. "Matteo," Vincenzo spoke into his radio, his voice chillingly devoid of emotion. "The kill zone is primed. Light them up." On the monitors, hidden gun ports in the concrete walls slid open. Paola watched, horrified and mesmerized, as the Coppola syndicate rained down hellfire on the trapped men. It was a massacre. It was ruthless, efficient, and deeply brutal. She turned her face away from the screens, her chest heaving, the reality of the violence finally catching up to her. Vincenzo noticed. He stepped between her and the monitors, blocking her view with his massive frame. He reached down, cupping her face in his hands. His thumbs gently wiped away a tear she did not realize she had shed. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Paola looked up into his dark, storm-gray eyes. "You survived," Vincenzo said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that commanded her absolute attention. "You fought back. Do not ever look away from your own strength, Paola. You are the one who just ended this war." Before Paola could process the heavy, intoxicating intensity in his gaze, a massive explosion shook the command center. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Matteo's voice crackled frantically over the radio. "Boss." It was a diversion. The main force was in the courtyard, but a splinter team blew through the subterranean sewage lines. They are in the basement. They are moving toward the command center. Hugo Lombardi is with them. Vincenzo's eyes darkened, the tender protector vanishing in an instant, replaced by the apex predator of the underworld. He drew his guns. "Stay behind the servers," Vincenzo ordered Paola, pointing to the massive steel racks humming in the back of the room. "Do not make a sound." The heavy steel door of the command center groaned as a breaching charge was slapped against it. Vincenzo grabbed a heavy tactical desk and flipped it over, creating a barricade. Paola scrambled backward, her thick rubber-soled boots slipping on the polished concrete until she wedged herself behind the server racks. She pulled her knees to her chest, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The door blew inward in a shower of sparks and shrapnel. 3 men stepped through the smoke, firing blindly. Vincenzo returned fire, his shots measured and devastating. 2 men dropped instantly. The third ducked behind the ruined doorway, laying down, covering fire. And then, stepping over the bodies of his own men, came Hugo Lombardi. He was an older man, dressed in a ruined bespoke suit, his face contorted in a mask of pure desperation. He held an automatic weapon, scanning the room frantically. "Coppola!" Hugo screamed, his voice raw. "I know the girl is here. Hand over the drives, and I leave your compound. Keep them, and we burn this city to the ground." Vincenzo stood slowly from behind the barricade, his guns aimed squarely at Hugo's chest. "You are in no position to negotiate, Hugo. Your men are dead in the courtyard. Your empire is bleeding out, and the woman you are looking for belongs to me." Hugo laughed, a manic, breathless sound. "Belongs to you? She is a rat. A fat, miserable little hacker who got lucky. Where is she?" Hugo's eyes darted around the room, and locked onto the small gap between the server racks. He saw the edge of Paola's oversized coat. Hugo raised his weapon toward the servers. A primal roar ripped from Vincenzo's throat. He did not seek cover. He stepped directly into the line of fire, becoming a human shield between Hugo and the corner where Paola hid. Vincenzo fired twice. The sound of the gunshots was deafening in the enclosed space. Hugo Lombardi's weapon clattered to the ground. He stood frozen for a fraction of a second, a look of profound shock registering on his weathered face, before his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the ruined floor of the command center, a dark pool of blood spreading rapidly across his ruined suit. Silence descended upon the room, broken only by the hum of the servers and the distant, muffled sounds of Matteo's men securing the rest of the compound. Paola stayed wedged behind the metal racks, her whole body trembling. She waited for the sounds of more gunfire, for men to rush the room. But nothing came. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her legs feeling like lead. She peered around the edge of the machinery. Vincenzo was standing over Hugo's lifeless body, his guns lowered, but still gripped tightly in his hands. He was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, his crisp white shirt torn and stained with red. But he stood completely motionless, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He turned his head, his sharp eyes cutting through the smoke to find her. The lethal, cold emptiness that had been in his eyes moments before vanished the second he saw her standing there, unhurt. He dropped his weapons on the floor. The heavy thuds echoed loudly. Vincenzo closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He grabbed Paola, pulling her against his chest with a fierce, crushing desperation. Paola gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his broad shoulders. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply, his massive frame trembling slightly against hers. "You are safe," Vincenzo murmured against her skin, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded dangerously close to fear. "You are safe." Paola leaned into him, finally allowing the walls she had built over the last 6 months to crumble. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the hard, lean muscle beneath his ruined shirt. She cried, silent tears soaking into his collar, the sheer exhaustion of her survival finally breaking her. Vincenzo did not let go. He held her entirely, his hands roaming over her back, down to the soft, heavy curve of her hips, anchoring her to him. He reveled in her softness, the substantial, warm reality of her body pressed against his. She was not fragile glass that would shatter. She was earth and fire, resilient and beautiful. "It is over," Paola whispered, her voice cracking. "He is dead. It is just beginning," Vincenzo replied, pulling back slightly to look down at her face. He framed her flush, tear-stained cheeks with his large hands. "Hugo Lombardi is gone," Vincenzo continued, his voice dropping into that dark, possessive octave that made Paola's pulse race. "But the vacuum he leaves behind will tear the underworld apart. I need the drives, Paola. I need the ledgers to absorb his territory, to buy the politicians, to cement my grip on the East Coast." Paola looked at him, wiping a tear from her eye. The terror of the last few hours was fading, replaced by a sudden, terrifying clarity. She was standing in a room with dead bodies, held in the arms of the most dangerous man in the city, and she realized with absolute certainty that she did not want to leave. The normal world held nothing for her anymore. Vincenzo had offered her protection, but he was also offering her power. She reached into the neckline of her shirt, her fingers finding the hidden seam in the fabric of her bra. She pulled out the 2 small encrypted thumb drives. They were warm from her skin. She held them up between them. "These are worth billions," Paola said, her voice steadying. "They are the keys to a kingdom." Vincenzo looked at the drives, then back to her deep brown eyes. "I do not care about the kingdom, Paola. I care about the Queen." He did not take the drives from her hand. Instead, he placed his hand over hers, closing her fingers around the plastic. "Keep them," Vincenzo said. "They are your leverage, your insurance. You earned this empire. Pyre as much as I did today. You are not a guest here, Paola, and you are certainly not a prisoner. You are my partner." Paola stared at him, stunned. A mafia boss handing absolute power to a woman he had met hours ago. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw no deception. She saw a deep, unyielding obsession. He worshipped her mind. He worshipped her resilience. And by the way his hands rested heavily on her waist, she knew he worshipped her body. "What happens now?" she asked, her breath catching as his thumb traced her lower lip. "Now," Vincenzo murmured, leaning in until their lips were a breath apart. "We take the city. And then you are going to let me show you exactly how a king treats his queen." He kissed her, and it was a collision of violence and passion. It was dark, demanding, and utterly consuming. Paola surrendered to it, her hands tangling in his dark hair as he swept her up into his arms, carrying her out of the blood-stained command center and up toward the penthouse. The ghost was gone. The Queen had arrived. If this dark and gripping mafia romance had you on the edge of your seat, do not leave. Just smash that like button to show your support and share this story with fellow romance and thriller lovers. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite part of Vincenzo and Paola's journey, or what you want to hear next. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another intense, high-stakes underworld tale.